Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Idahoan Show. Today, I thought it might be useful to talk a little bit about steel targets and homemade steel targets in particular. In the last 5 to 10 years, I think we've seen a real explosion in the popularity of shooting steel, and I think that's for good reason. After all, if you're serious about developing and maintaining and improving your shooting skills, then there's a real advantage to shooting reactive targets because they provide you with instant feedback as to whether or not your shot was effective. And that, of course, is true regardless of whether you're shooting a steel target that falls over or a water bottle that explodes. However, if you're practicing regularly and putting in a substantial amount of practice, then it's arguably a lot more practical to have a set of durable steel targets that you can reuse over and over and over again, rather than having to hunt up a bunch of water bottles and fill them with water and then stuff them in trash bags after you've successfully reduced them to shredded plastic every time you want to go shooting. Now, the increase in popularity of shooting steel has led to an attendant explosion in the availability of commercially made steel targets, but in case you still are interested in making your own, I thought I would take this opportunity to show you a couple of designs that I've used over the years and talk a little bit about how they worked out. Now, this is the first target design that I want to talk about. I made 4 of these over a decade ago, and they're still basically my go-to general purpose target. It just consists of a mild steel plate about 8 inches square by about an inch thick, and it's welded to a rebar stand that gives it an overall height of about 30 inches, while the feet that allow it to stand up are about 8 inches long. This has proven to be a really good combination. It stands up reliably in the wind. It's not particularly vulnerable to falling over due to environmental factors that you don't want to knock it over, but it will consistently fall over from a solid hit from 223, 38 special, just about any center fire cartridge that I would normally practice with. Now, some people will tell you that if you're going to make steel targets, you have to use some kind of specialty high-strength steel, like AR-500. That's not necessarily the case. Like I said, these are just mild steel plates, and yet these targets have taken thousands of hits over the last decade, and they're still in pretty good shape. They've still got a lot of life left in them. You just have to be a little bit careful about how you use them. Specifically, I reserve this side of the target for close-range practice with pistol calibers only. So you can see the plate is still relatively flat. There's a few little divots from hotter loads with 44 Magnum, but the plate is flat enough that any pistol bullet that hits it is just going to spread out on the plane of the plate. Any spalling is going to come off in the plane of the plate, and so it's not going to really create a hazard if I'm shooting it at close range. The other side of the plate is what I use for rifle practice at distances not less than 50 yards. Now, this side of the plate, as you can see, is deeply cratered, and that creates a possibility that you could have spalling coming off those angled surfaces of the crater and basically coming back at me. However, the fragments of spalling material are pretty small and they have a very high air resistance. So they slow down pretty quickly, and the spalling hazard is greatly reduced the further I am from the target. Based on experience, I've found that if I'm 50 yards back, there doesn't seem to be much of an issue, at least shooting this with 223. Now, you might ask, well, if 223 craters the surface of the plate like this, over time, isn't it going to start punching all the way through, once you get a couple of craters on top of each other? Actually, no. And the reason for that is that the steel work hardens. So when you get an initial impact, the bullet makes a crater, but it also makes the surface of that crater very, very hard. And then once the whole surface of the plate is covered with craters, now you have this very irregular surface of very hard steel. And so subsequent rounds are going to hit most likely at an angle, hitting an angled surface because the surface is so uneven and the surface is very hard. So the penetration of those subsequent hits is very, very minimal. And so as long as you've got enough thickness in the plate to withstand that initial phase of cratering, after that, the rate of wear on the plate tapers off to almost nothing, and it can be shot for a long time before it eventually wears out. So these targets have served me well over more than the past decade, and I fully expect that they'll serve me well for decades to come. About the only maintenance that they require is occasionally re-welding something if I should happen to shoot the rebar and either break the rebar frame or break a weld or something along those lines. However, more recently, I came up with a more sophisticated target design that actually didn't work out as well as I was hoping. But I want to show you that design and talk about what worked and what didn't. So this is my fancy new sophisticated target design. It consists of a 3/8 inch thick AR500 plate inside of this heavy-duty angle iron frame with some studs that I can use to mount a piece of plywood or wafer board to the front. As I've done on this target here. So you can see the wafer board. I can staple a paper target to that if I want some additional visual indication. And then what will happen is the bullet will go through the wafer board. It'll hit the AR500. And then, because the AR500 is hard enough that it won't crater appreciably, the lead fragments will all pretty much spall off in the plane of the plate. They'll hit the angle iron frame and be captured by it. And so not only is the spalling hazard completely eliminated, but when I'm done shooting, I can take the wafer board off, dump out the lead fragments into a melting pot, and cast more bullets. At least that was the theory. In practice, it kind of worked. The targets were actually quite effective at eliminating spalling, or I should say containing spalling, as long as they were hit in the nominal target area. Trouble is, as you can see by these smears of lead on the side here, they weren't always hit exactly in the nominal target area. And if you hit the side of the angle iron, now you've got a bullet impacting an angled surface, you've got a perfect scenario for a ricochet. So you're eliminating a spalling hazard, but you're creating a ricochet hazard. Which is worse? Is it a good trade-off? Depends on the situation. As for being able to recover and reuse the lead, well, when the bullet goes through the wafer board, it blasts a lot of fragments of wood fiber out the back of the board, which also get trapped or contained inside the target. And so you've got really little pieces of lead that are interspersed with and embedded in all these fragments of wood. And you can recover some lead from that, but it's definitely not as clean and easy of a process as what I was initially envisioning of just being able to dump out fragments of pure lead and melt it down directly. So in the end, my fancy, sophisticated targets kind of worked, but not really well enough to justify all of the additional trouble and expense that I went to get the AR500 plates and weld up the fancy angle iron containment structure and so on and so forth. Quite honestly, for most of what I would use them for, a simple slab of 1-inch thick A36 plate would do just as well. So hopefully you found this information useful, and until next time, thank you for watching the Idahoan Show.